Hello, business law students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 2, the Constitution. And we're going to look at Section 1, Foundation of the U.S. Constitution. So, our founding fathers, these wonderful men, who I'm probably missing a few, but these men really sacrificed a lot for our nation. I think a lot of people are familiar with maybe George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, perhaps maybe Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. But the thing of it is, our founders, when they came up with the idea for the Constitution, were doing so because our original form of government, the Articles of Confederation, were kind of messy. So let's talk about these documents that help form us. First one being the Declaration of Independence. All it was like a statement notifying the world that we were freeing ourselves from England. It was ratified on July 4th, 1776, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson under the guidance of Ben Franklin and John Adams and such. But this document that kind of starts our nation was broken down into a few different pieces. There was a preamble to it. There was a statement just basically saying that this is our statement to become independent. But probably the most dramatic part of this whole document was a long list of grievances that our founding fathers had against King George III of England. And it kind of starts off like he did this and he did this. And that's kind of the gist of this document, that we would go on to fight a revolutionary war to kind of see if we could actually live up to what we were declaring. Uh, During this war revolution, we needed a government, and our Articles of Confederation becomes our first government here in this newly United States of America. It was ratified in the year 1781, and it was the first system of government for our United States. Unfortunately, there were a lot of issues with the Articles of Confederation. There were a lot of flaws. First of all, being the fact that you only had one branch of government, that was the legislative branch. You could write laws, but it was really hard to enforce any laws. You could write laws, but it was really hard to interpret these laws, and hence there was going to be a need for another form of government. So, 1787, after the War of Independence, our Constitution is going to be ratified. And it kind of all goes down to the fact that the founders who were living under the Articles decided that they needed to get together and maybe have a convention to see whether or not they could fix the problem. Our founders who gathered in Philadelphia pretty much determined that it would be a lot easier to throw the whole Articles of Confederation out and start brand new. And that's kind of where this comes from. Truth is, our founders who did this were basically overthrowing their government, if it really wanted to come down to that. But it was a very peaceful transition of powers. So it is currently our system of government here in the United States. Our first 10 amendments to our Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. That was something that was added as a compromise to get certain states to sign on to this. And within these amendments, we should talk about some of the freedoms and responsibilities that we have. So, under the First Amendment, it provides for the freedoms of religion, speech, press, peaceful assembly, meaning that people gathering with permission, and the right to petition our government. In other words, my right as a citizen to write to our individuals who are in Congress or in the White House or perhaps maybe in the judicial system to state my grievances. Second Amendment protects our right to keep and bear arms. The Third Amendment provides that during times of peace, that citizens would not be required to quarter soldiers without the consent of the government, and also compensation from the government. Fourth Amendment protects people from unreasonable searches and seizures of their property. Fifth Amendment, which is probably one of the longer of the amendments, has many provisions, but it contains primarily the rights of the accused. Things about double jeopardy, self-incrimination are kind of tied into this. Sixth Amendment provides for the right for a speedy and public trial. And Seventh Amendment provides for the right to a trial by jury in civil cases. Eighth Amendment provides protection against cruel and unusual punishment and protection against excessive bail. Ninth Amendment mentions that we have more rights than those mentioned in the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment says that the powers that are not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the state governments. So, the Bill of Rights was adopted when 4 of the original 13 colonies didn't ratify the Constitution because they thought that it didn't provide adequate protection for human rights and that were proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. And thus they held out, and this was added on. You could talk about that fight between really the anti-federalists, who were kind of those people who held out for ratification here until this Bill of Rights was added, and those people who were the Federalists. Anyway, civil rights. There are a few amendments that kind of are tied into this. First of all, the due process of law is a fundamental fairness. We can find that within primarily our amendments that we're going to mention here. But First Amendment does protect our right to peaceful assembly. Fourth Amendment provides the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. Fifth Amendment provides protections from having to testify against oneself in a trial. Seventh Amendment provides for a trial by jury, primarily in a civil case, which would be like tort law. The abolition of slavery, which kind of gets into kind of our Civil War amendments, primarily the 13th here, when our founding fathers were debating the ratification of the Constitution. One of the issues that was kind of an issue when we talk about support for the document was the issue of slavery. And there were a couple different compromises that were hammered out by founders to kind of hopefully resolve the issue, which it really didn't. The 3/5 compromise, which was proposed by northern states, that would count those people who were enslaved as 3/5 of a person in determining the population of southern states for representation in the House of Representatives. The Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise basically stated that slaves could no longer be imported to the U.S. after the year 1808. Did it stop slavery? No. Did it go on? Yes. And it kind of changed the whole institution of that as far as making sure that those people who wanted to keep slaves were able to do so by encouraging more children to be born. Anyway, during the Civil War, the Union, the North, proposed the 13th Amendment, which would outlaw slavery in the U.S. And when the war wraps up, those states that were in rebellion, meaning the southern states, the Confederate states, had to adopt the Constitution and had to ratify the 13th Amendment as part of that. Right to vote. There were several amendments that kind of address this as well. 15th Amendment, which again, part of the Civil War amendments, protects the right to vote of African American males. This was ratified in those days right after the Civil War. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified to the Constitution, which protects the rights of women to vote. In the early 1960s, because of the Civil Rights Movement, the 24th Amendment was ratified, and this amendment forbids the use of a poll tax in determining voting rights. Along with that, that would also mean you can't use a literacy test. This whole notion of a grandfather clause, that gets thrown out as well. With the Vietnam War, there was concerns about the voting rights of those people who were being drafted. So in 1972, the 26th Amendment was ratified, which allows 18-year-olds the right to vote in the United States. Peripheral rights. These are rights that are kind of on the fringes here. These are rights that are the rights not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but are necessary to protecting the rights that are mentioned in both documents. As an example, the right to privacy, which is not really anywhere within the first eight amendments. But when we talk about the Ninth Amendment, which is kind of a catch all, just saying that we have more rights, that's kind of where privacy lands. Thank you very much.